Hello and welcome to another Times Radio Members Question and Answer. Today we're answering comments and questions from our channel members on Frontline and other videos about current conflicts and their impact on the world stage. I'm Philip Ingram, a former senior British military intelligence officer and commentator on all matters geopolitics, defence, security, terrorism and everything else. And we've got some fantastic questions today. I'm going to start off straight away with one from Dave. And Dave says Europe needs to rearm, as does Canada. Does Canada have material capacity and will it become a supplier of choice for itself or for Europe? That's an interesting one. Canada is in a very interesting position because they don't spend 2% of their GDP as they are required to do by being a NATO member. That's 2% of GDP on defence. And they're also Five Eyes members. So Donald Trump sees Canada as weak. And Canada has got a unique part of protecting the Northern Hemisphere community in its influence up into the Arctic, which is something that Donald Trump is focused on. So Europe needs to rearm. Canada needs to rearm hugely. Otherwise, we're going to see more and more pressure, not just economically on Canada, but from a military perspective. It wouldn't surprise me if Donald Trump starts to put restrictions on military arms sales into Canada, which would be setting a very difficult precedent for a Five Eyes member. I don't think the United States would try and exclude Canada from Five Eyes because they are too important geographically, given the geographic spread that Canada is. But I think there's going to be a lot of pressure for Canada to increase its defence spending to beyond the 2% that the new Canadian Prime Minister has said that he wants to achieve by 2030. They should be at 2% today. Of course, Canada, I think, would be one of the coalition of the willing that would provide troops to any peacekeeping force inside Ukraine if that became possible. Canada has always supported operations around the world and, of course, supplied troops into Afghanistan, which was part of and a result of the only Article 5 call in NATO's history, and that was called with the United States post 9/11. So has Canada got the ability to supply other European countries? Potentially with some smaller items and everything else, but I think its defence industrial base is behind where Europe is at the moment. It's got a lot of effort to put in to build that defence industrial base up, move it away from North America in general, and to try and get into a position where it can look after itself and then start to look after Europe. I think Europe will be supplying more to Canada and possibly countries like South Korea. Smart Gran, good that you've come back again, Smart Gran. Always love your comments on your questions. And you say you don't agree with Ukraine giving its wealth to Trump under pressure from the greedy and despicable criminal. If Europe gives Putin any concessions to Ukraine, surely we'll be fighting again in a few years. You've hit the ball quite centrally, and it is flying in exactly the right direction, Smart Gran. Ukraine and its wealth. I think the mineral deal that there is at the moment, the new one after that, Zelensky refused to sign the one that caused that debacle in the Oval Office in the White House a few days ago or a couple of weeks ago, is very different. And it's more setting the principles out. There's no real detail in it. And a lot of the minerals that Ukraine are sharing with America in this it's sharing. They're still in the ground. There aren't economically viable mines in place. It's based on geological assessments of where these minerals are. And it'll take a large amount of investment from companies to be able to extract them properly. And that investment, you're coming from the United States, it would have to, if you've signed this deal, is something that would then benefit Ukraine. So I don't think Zelensky's giving a lot away. He's potentially benefiting a lot from it, but it's that length of time and how much there is, and trying to predict what this will do to influence future economics is important. But I agree with you. If Europe gives Putin any concessions in Ukraine, and it's not up to Europe to give the concessions, this is up to the Ukrainian people. But if Ukraine gives any concessions to Putin, and especially if those are forced by the United States, then we will be fighting again in a few years. Putin will see it as a salami slicing approach to getting Ukraine. That will still remain his objective. But what worries me more is it would set a real precedent to the likes of Xi Jinping, and he may turn around and say that now is the time to go and take Taiwan by force. I've said this before, I'll say it again, and I'll keep saying it. If we see a Southeast Asian pivot, if Xi Jinping goes for Taiwan, the economic shock that will hit the world will seem like, will make the economic shock that we suffered whenever Russia carried out its full-scale invasion of Ukraine just over 3 years ago seem like loose change down the back of the sofa. Nick comes in with the next comment and says, I hope the damage caused by the temporary cessation of intelligence sharing is not too serious. How many Ukrainian soldiers now dead might be alive if only no pause had been imposed in the first place? Nick, a very valid point and a very good question. The real answer is we don't know. Will it have caused casualties? Yes. Were those casualties purely military casualties? No. We know the Russians exploited the lack of intelligence to advance in the Kursk region and to split off the Ukrainian troops there and surround them. That will have resulted in many hundreds dead. Whether that was purely because of the intelligence being cut off, it's very difficult to assess without sitting down and talking to the commanders on the ground. But civilians have died as well because a lot of the early warning was cut. And we saw Putin exploit that with some of his ballistic missile attacks against civilian infrastructure and places of residence. So there have been casualties. And that, I think, if you examine it, is too serious. One unnecessary death is too serious, and therefore Trump's tactics have caused unnecessary deaths. Nick, you're in again. And you're on my sheet in front of me as Nick again, which is great. You go on to say, George Folks touched on something that I don't think has got nearly enough publicity, which is the initiative by Norway to support Ukraine. It's unusual, but both imaginative and effective in two, and I think 3 ways. He's bankrolled the salaries of Ukrainian office workers and created a fund to finance the restoration of Ukrainian infrastructure destroyed by Russia or damaged by Russia. What this initiative has initially also done is free up Ukrainian funds to finance its war against Russia. Yes, you've hit the nail on the head, and it's all about making sure that Ukraine can continue to fund what it needs. And this came through at a time of uncertainty as to whether there was going to be any American funding coming in, and whilst the EU was trying to work out how they were going to do things, there's a lot of moving parts going on. And actually what we'll see with the building up of the coalition of the willing, as it comes closer to there being a proper peace agreement that then potentially has to be policed, is different countries manoeuvring in a way to help rebuild Ukraine, because the rebuilding of Ukraine is going to attract international money and international resources, and that can be channeled into nationally owned or companies that represent different nations, channel into them so that the tax dollars from that, or tax euros or tax pounds, goes back into those companies. The French are past masters at this, which is why they have signed up to being part of the coalition of the willing very early. They did this in Bosnia and had already pre-let many contracts to French companies to rebuild Sarajevo even before the Dayton Peace Agreement had been signed. So there will be lots of work going on in the background to try and take advantage of the rebuilding of Ukraine. So Anthony now, the right time to push Putin back was in December 2021. Well, yes, Anthony, actually the right time to push Putin back would have been way back in 2014 when he carried out that silent invasion of Crimea. And we've missed an opportunity. And every time we've missed an opportunity. December 2021, there was still the debate going on as to whether Putin was carrying out another major military maneuver or whether it was real. It wasn't until January 2022 that the indicators changed, where we saw the outloading of combat supplies right to the front line, and in particular medical supplies. The trigger for me, as I was analysing it, was the reporting of blood being outloaded. Blood's perishable. It's very difficult to store in field conditions. You don't outload it unless you're going to use it. That was a clear indicator that this wasn't just manoeuvres. This was Russia going to cross the front line and carry out a full-scale invasion of Ukraine which happened sometime later. So yes, Anthony, you're right, but I'd say back to 2014. And finally, Ben, you said you'd love to hear Stig, and you're talking of Stig Abel, the Times radio presenter in the morning show, ask Ms. Harper Hayes, okay, no NATO for Ukraine, but then Russia must agree to retreat to the pre-2014 frontiers, and we must add security guarantees to Ukraine. What would be the Trump administration position? And you say, I believe Zelensky in Ukraine would accept that. Yes, Ben, you're right. There are so many things that should be done, and they are just right to do. And Russia being forced back to the pre-2014 boundaries is the right thing to do. It's something that President Zelensky realizes he's not going to achieve in this, and something that Donald Trump, in his desire to try and get a peace agreement in his first 100 days, is going to push to do. They'll push it off to the future in negotiating that. And that could take as long as the reunification of Cyprus, the North Korea, South Korea issues, a long time. But again, from a theoretical perspective, yeah, you're spot on, Ben. Thanks for watching this week's question and answer, and for posting your questions. Remember, if you want access to exclusive videos and to have your questions answered, please sign up for Times Radio membership. Thank you for watching today. Goodbye.